You're doing so good. So I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. But yeah, let's do this thing. Who's ever said, I love failing? The only people who say that are either sarcastic or overly optimistic. It's that type of motivational speaker, inspirational content creator optimism that is weirdly positive, and maybe they're just so devoid of emotion that they can pick and choose what emotions Instagram wants. Like, yes, we get it. We know that you need to fail forward. We know that failure is an opportunity to get better, and we know that failure is a step to success, or insert whatever motivational quote you want. By the way, I am no doubt a product of United States productivity and success subculture. But no matter how much you may invite failure, and no matter how much you may see failure as a means to succeed, that does not make the feeling of failure any less powerful. But what's even worse is when you fail someone who's investing in you. A parent or a parent figure, a coach, a mentor, a teacher, a person who you've told, hey, I'm your person, call on me and I'll deliver. And yet when the time comes, you royally screw up. You totally fail with no excuse, and you're left with feelings, and only feelings of grief, of shame, and that you can't look that person in the eye anymore. And that's how Peter felt. So this morning we hear from John 21, verses 15 through 20. And Jesus and his disciples are on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, where they've just finished breakfast, and it's a breakfast of fish and bread, which Jesus has prepared for them. Which, side note, I love this because I'm Filipino. And so my heritage is from an island nation. There's some people in the room who understand we eat a lot of fish at home. So in other words, fish is holy. Anyways, this is the third time that Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection. And can you imagine Peter in this moment? Can you imagine what Peter is experiencing? It's a gut-wrenching grief in his stomach, where he starts to replay that night where Jesus was on his way to his resurrection. He begins to relive the scene where he denied Jesus, and then Jesus breaks his flashback. He gets his attention, and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. And then he asks him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter replies, trying to sound more convincing, he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And so Jesus says, tend my sheep. Jesus raises the question a third time, and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And it says that Peter is grieved after this third time. We can imagine him fighting back the feeling of shame, his voice straining, and him desperately crying, yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And so Jesus says, feed my lambs. And it's in this moment that the memory of the fateful night rolls its tape in Peter's head, the room where they had their last meal. And Jesus said, you would deny me 3 times, and you would do this before the rooster crowed. The memory of the servant girl approaching Peter and identifying him as one who stood with Jesus, and Peter saying, no, woman, I don't know this man. And then that same girl goes to all the bystanders and says, this one was with Jesus of Nazareth. And Peter says, I swear, I do not know this man. And then Peter shudders. He shudders as he remembers his answer to the third accusation. He hears how he angrily cursed himself, saying, I do not know this Jesus that you are speaking of. And then he hears the rooster cry. And in replaying this night in his head on the shore of Galilee, the feelings of grief and shame, they're all too familiar. They flood him in an instant. He had failed Jesus when it counted most. We've been in Peter's shoes, haven't we? Or rather, his sandals. Jesus sees Peter's denial, his failure. Jesus sees the shame Peter felt, the shame of being a follower of Christ, that Peter was willing to follow this fool who promised these things, and yet he's on the cross. Jesus also sees the fear that Peter felt, What's going to happen to me if people know that I stood with Jesus in that time? Peter also sees the anguish Jesus also sees the anguish that Peter felt. That this self-proclaimed Son of God, who I, Peter, dropped everything to follow, is now being hung on a cross. He's being humiliated and murdered, and he's not even going to stand up for himself. Peter would be pretty angry at God, at himself. Jesus sees all of that, and he looked at Peter as the rooster crowed, and just what he had foretold had happened. And what does Jesus say? He says, so what? I want you with me. Jesus goes on to foretell how Peter is going to glorify God in his death, but we don't have time for that. Following that, Jesus says the words that he offered to Peter when he had first called him, and he says, follow me. Understand that when Peter was an eager and willing fisherman filled with potential, Jesus wanted him. And when Peter was struck with grief because he failed Jesus when it counted most, Jesus still wanted him. Better yet, Jesus wanted to make himself clear to Peter, and so he entrusts him with his lambs. In the face of Peter's failure, Jesus says, I want you. I want you to be with me, so I'm going to ask you to follow me again. And also, I want you to know that I'm serious about me wanting you, and so I'm going to give you responsibility of something that I love and cherish and deeply care for. Hear the word of God today. Jesus wants you. See the immense value that Jesus places on your life. See how Jesus looks at you, and perhaps all the times that you failed him, and he says, you're worth it. I want you. Follow me. When you say you want nothing to do with him, Jesus says, I want you. When you proudly proclaim his name, but in the crucial hour you turn your back on him, he wants you. And when your thoughts, your past, your feelings convince you that you're not deserving of being with him, that you deserve to be cast aside, Jesus wants you. Hear that today. And it's not like Jesus has his memory wiped. Jesus sees those failures. And it's in the face of viewing these failures, he points at us. He points at all of you and he says, I want you. And I want you. And I want you. That's ridiculous. I'm a fairly logical guy. I like making sense of life, right? But here, Jesus takes whatever box of logic that we put him in, and he goes, yeah. Like, that doesn't make sense that he's willing to say, I want you, after time and time and time again that we fail him. That does not make sense, and yet he says, I want you, and I want you again, and I want you to follow me. Hear that today. We fail him time and time and time again, and every time he extends his hand and says, I want you. Come be on my team. So how do we make this more than a sentimental, emotion-invoking moment on some Thursday morning at the end of the year? Number one, remember. Also, Joanna, you could put on that slide. Number one, remember. Remember by yourself and remember with your friends. That can mean writing, Jesus wants me despite my failures, on a sticky note and putting it on your desk or mirror. And that can mean you and a friend commit to texting each other daily saying Jesus wants you despite your failures. That can mean drawing something that tells you I'm wanted by Jesus despite my failures. But in any case, remember, it's an action. It's a hard thing to do, and it's something that feels dumb and immaterial, but it's something that is vital. Number two is respond. Respond to what it means that Jesus wants you despite your failures. This is by far the harder one. This is by far the one that requires way more humility. Respond to Jesus' acceptance by re-examining what it means to follow him. Because just as Jesus called us the first time, saying, follow me, he extends his call to us again, even when we've failed, and he says, follow me. For some of us, this might start with having to humble ourselves and accept Jesus' opinion of us and not our own opinion of us. This might start with having to accept that we're not perfect and that we will fail, but when we accept that we won't fail, we just get a glimpse. We just begin to realize the grace that Jesus has for us when we do fail. To follow Jesus is to humbly tell him how I've been running my life with all the self-hate and the beating myself up and the judging others because I'm afraid of having my failures exposed. That's not working, and I need you to guide me. That takes humility to say, I don't have it all down. Rather, Jesus, I need you to guide me. Now, much of this application is reflective. Jesus wants you despite your failures. That's not really a thing that you can go and do. It's reflective. But allow yourself to wonder for just a moment, how would my life change if I remember that Jesus wants me despite my failures? How would humbly accepting what Jesus thinks of me change how I act? How would it change how I treat myself, treat others, and how I treat Jesus? Jesus knows and sees your failures, and he says, so what? Jesus wants you, and Jesus wants you despite your failures. Thank you.